We're just, folk online, we're just moving microphones around. And then, Wendy, if you go next.
The leadership in humanitarian aid will certainly improve a lot more when the leadership in a wider area is improved. The fact that 50 years or 60 years of foreign aid hasn't produced much effect on the southern hemisphere, and the very fact that the Leadership Institute in Africa was started a few years ago by Professor Rothberg and Abraham, that should open the eyes of all the people.
Okay, thank you very much. Wendy Fenton, do you want to?
Thanks, Wendy Fenton from the Humanitarian Practice Network. No, I also wanted to say that I found the report extremely interesting, and having read the first one too, it's really interesting to see some of the different perspectives that you picked up on. And one of the things I didn't hear mentioned today, but I wondered whether it came out in your research, is this issue of the burden of bureaucracy, which is slightly different from the procedures and standard operating procedures. But I think in the first piece of research done on leadership that ALNAP was engaged in, there was a sense that for individual leaders anyway, the burden of bureaucracy and the reporting bureaucracy was really crippling. And I wondered if you found that that was also the case for teams. Did any of that come through in the research that you did here? Because also I think procedures too, there's a danger sometimes that they can be an excuse for taking leadership decisions sometimes because you feel that everything's taken care of. But in the case of bureaucracy in particular, I'm curious about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. And then perhaps two more over here, and then I'll hand over to Chris and Steve.
Yeah, thank you. It is very interesting study, and it is very courageous step to do study in this field. I've been leading the humanitarian crisis in 2010 in Pakistan, and I really appreciate what has been done here because it is much needed. But there is one surprise for me is the lack of mention of accountability in the study, because that is the area which relates to different culture in different ways. And study in one culture may not fit to another culture. For example, here, if you are talking of including the national staff in the leadership, I would love to have all my national staff in the leadership, but there are some cultural problems and it give rise to accountability. And also it is putting the risk of the organization in the hands of local people, because we have experienced that in some areas of Pakistan where people were kidnapped such to get the contract from some organization through the national staff.
Okay.
So this kind of study is needed in this direction, how we could avoid those issues.
Thank you very much indeed. And then one more behind you, and then we'll come back after we've been online.
Thank you. And thanks, I'd like to say to ALNAP and others for the report.
Could you just say who you are? Sorry, I should have asked people to do that.
Catherine Nightingale from Christian Aid. Thank you. Two questions. One, particularly for Paul, really, to perhaps pick up on a point that the other panellists talked a bit about, which was whether, in terms of cultural difference, you're actually describing culture. That actually there's an interesting question about whether the cultural difference lies more clearly across sectors, and in this context, quite a focused look at the operational working area of a humanitarian organisation and its structures versus other business models or structures, and whether that's actually where the cultural difference might lie. Because I know we talked a little bit about that, but it'd be interesting to see what the research spoke to, I think, in that respect. And then more broadly, across the panel, to understand a bit more about where risk-taking and trust lies in this, because in leadership, and I mean, we heard a little bit about the rules to break the rules, but I think being much clearer and understanding much more clearly how leaders are able to take risks and have the support structures to do that, and what trust looks like in that context would be really helpful.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. So, Paul, do you want to answer the sort of research-specific piece?
Happy to.
And then maybe over to Chris, then Steve, on bureaucracy, accountability, risk, and all sorts of other very relevant challenges.
So on the, maybe taking the culture point, we were actually looking, I mean, the structure of the report is very strong. There are a lot of things that are not in the report which are very interesting in general, and so I think we've hit straight onto several of them. And that's largely to do with the structure of the report. We had to scope it very, very tightly in order. What we were trying to do is to try and produce evidence around very specific hypotheses, so to prove or disprove very specific hypotheses. It doesn't mean that hypotheses that we weren't looking at are not important. It only means we weren't looking at it, and so we didn't generate any evidence around those areas. Because the methodology was using was to say, you know, this is what we want evidence about. Is this or is this? Do we have evidence for or against this proposition? Bureaucracy was one of the things, for example, we didn't look at, and the risk issue in more broadly was one of the things that we didn't look at. Although there are some links to delegation that we did look at, and that which is true in the country office around delegation is also, we were told in the interviews, true more broadly around delegation, that country officers would like more delegated. They think it works better where more things are delegated to them. But that was not, it wasn't a focus of the report. So apologies for that. Similarly, accountability. Culture was one of the things that we were particularly specifically looking at on the basis of the literature review. We were really interested to see, we came from a place where we were, and I can't remember exactly how the hypothesis was put, but it was basically that the individual approach to leadership, the assumption that leadership is best done by an individual, was culturally and gender specific. And so it was something that was more likely to be found among men than among women. And it was something that was more likely to be found among what we broadly defined as Anglo-Saxons, English-speaking, than among other groups. And we thought that was important, interesting in itself, because there's quite a lot of literature from other sectors that suggest that this is the case. But we also thought it was important because if that were true, and I think Chris was tackling this earlier on, if that were true, we would have created a system which made it very difficult for people who came from a different cultural background to enter. Yeah? And so we were hypothesizing that people from women and people from non-Anglo-Saxon cultures will find it, will be less likely to see leadership as an individual rather than a group or an organizational thing. And that's what we looked at, and we found no evidence that that was the case, and that is, I think, surprising.
Very cheeky, if I can ask a very quick follow-up question.
Honestly, I'm afraid we're not going to be able to do that because we've got lots of online questions and we do need to, maybe out of the room afterwards, that would be a good one to follow up. Is that okay?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, okay, so on that round of topics, Steve, do you want to reflect?
I think on the subject of leadership development, particularly in the Southern Hemisphere, I mean, I'm from the Southern Hemisphere. I'm involved with the Humanitarian Leadership Academy that Save the Children is leading on, and there's a lot of these kinds of things, that we're focusing in on. The question of culture consistently comes up in those types of opportunities, and the breadth of articulation of leadership and the styles are you can't pin it down. So I think that's there. On the question of bureaucracy, look, I think it's got to do more with rigidity of bureaucracy and the way that it's applied, and a lot of the systems that we've developed is because external control has been being forced on to operational people, and you get the dynamic where they're working 12 hours in the field, coming back to the office and backfilling a system for no apparent reason. And this is why we tried to switch it around and make it focused. I think the last bastion, if I can describe it that way, is control through accountability from donors. That we can ease up some of the process controls that are in funding mechanisms at the moment, in favour of accountability measures on outcomes and impact. I think on culture, I think we've already referred to it now.
Okay, thanks. Chris, do you want to pick up perhaps particularly on, I know this sounds rather dull of me, I apologise, but on the accountability and risk, it would be
well,
a
I do
shame
actually,
not
yeah. Yeah, this is what I deal with on a day-to-day basis, and certainly, yeah, the whole concept of risk management within WFP has evolved to understand a little bit more beyond just the contextual issues, which so often it's only really associated with risks, the security risks. You know, a lot of this has got to do with, you know, when we struggled in Somalia in 2009, I think it was, and we realised that some of our systems and procedures were not as tight as they should have been, and that, you know, we ended up facing quite a significant reputational risk because it seemed that we hadn't managed to control the way that food was being distributed. It was unfounded, but it kind of opened up a whole can of worms to look at issues such as the role of national staff and the responsibilities that are afforded to them and the risks that we maybe unwittingly put them under, given certain roles and responsibilities that are afforded to them. The extent to which the delegated authority that is afforded to a country director, and we are a very decentralized organization, and certainly, you know, new to the organization as a country director, you know, it was fantastically exciting to be given this responsibility as country director because of just the level of authority, delegated authority that you're afforded. Marvellous. But golly, does it come with some risks? And so this is why I come back to the issue of ensuring that there are systems in place to protect the decisions and the approach that you take as an organisation. And risk management systems, integrated enterprise risk management systems are really the key to this. And it's not to limit, constrain, straitjacket, but more as a way of being able to understand where your thresholds are, and to ensure that, you know, you're not putting people under undue pressure or situations which they're not necessarily capable of handling. And, you know, much of this comes back to then realising what the span of control is, for example, of individuals, understanding what the appropriate levels of responsibilities should be for commodity management or financial management and so on and so forth, and looking at all risk in a very comprehensive way. As I say, not to reduce or inhibit risk-taking, but to be able to manage risks. And increasingly we're discovering more and more we are putting people in incredibly difficult and untenable situations often. So there can be no substitute for an organisation to put in place the systems and the procedures and the process to protect them. Not to inhibit, protect.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Well, we've had a fantastic number of questions from people listening online. So I'm just going to pick out 2 or 3 So apologies if you've sent a question that doesn't come up, but I'm going to try and pick out some that perhaps take on slightly different angles or topics, and then again ask Steve and Chris to reflect on this. So one which has come from several people, including Mary Porman at Peace Winds and George Devendorf at Disaster Ready, is what approaches and methods are best used to strengthen or teach leadership, and how can organisations, particularly small organisations with few resources, cultivate good leaders and leadership teams? So there's something there particularly around smaller organisations. Then another interesting angle from Kevin Anyango of the Vitol Foundation, who asks what role donors can have apart from funding if they are to support effective leadership. And then a third, which again looks at a slightly different angle, from Catherine Haver of Humanitarian Outcomes, is, are there any leadership challenges you observe related to the humanitarian sector's difficulty in bringing in new individuals, either at a junior level or transferring from other sectors? So 3 questions which I think highlight the richness of the discussion and the report. So I will just give Steve and Chris a little time to reflect, and then up to you, whichever of you has gathered your thoughts soonest.
I'll have a crack at the
Go for it.
leadership development approaches. I think what we're finding out is that leadership is something that can be learned. You know, if you take the Aristotle model of apprenticeship over 15 years, the challenge was that as the number and complexity of emergencies grow, can you actually grow leaders in a shorter period of time? And I think taking out the apprenticeship models of, you know, knowledge, practice, reflection, and intentionally putting that into process, that can be done. You add in some mentoring or coaching, and leaders can be grown over time. But I think at the same time, it does take time. You can't do event-based, PowerPoint-driven information stuff and expect people to come out the other end as better leaders. It really is a learned practice, a learned skill. For smaller NGOs with that are resource challenged, I think, well, again, you can always do coaching and mentoring in situ. At least 70% of it on the job can occur. But also the fact that the industry is actually having more joint events and you know, participation in those is available. Jumping to the challenges of for new players and for transferring from other codes, probably the depth of complexity is one. While we've said that there is you know, we keep saying culture, but learning the culture of the industry as well as the application in different cultures, I think, is going to be another challenge. And I think for a lot of people, the sheer volume of what you need to deal with, the variety of people that you need to serve, the systems and sometimes archaic systems that you have to use, and then, like you said before, is representing a broad situational awareness to a multiplicity of different people.
Okay. Thanks, Sue.
Well, maybe just to reflect on a couple of the questions. You know, I'm very glad of the question asked about the role of donors to support leadership, because I mean, obviously in a voluntary funded situation, as most of our organisations are, we're entirely dependent on very much donors to provide us with the resources to grow those leaders, to support the training programmes within our various organisations. And I know very well they're not easy to fund. It's very, very difficult to get that additional funding to support growth and development of staff. So it's certainly something which I think a report such as this will help to bring attention to. But this is a collective challenge we all face, and we should approach it as a collective to demonstrate that this is something we believe is terribly important in our world. The humanitarian outcome question around how to bring in new people. This is an issue which, again, as an organisation, WFP have recognised is problematic, and we are approaching this in a quite a different way than perhaps we have done in the past, where we've allowed people to grow within the organisation in accordance with their particular area of specialty. So if you're involved in logistics, you run through a career in logistics. If you're involved in assessment, you become and remain a VAM officer all the way through the organisation. Now, this doesn't necessarily breed good leaders of the organisation. Certainly one of the aspects is to try to encourage cross-fertilisation of skills across the organisation, to get people to also understand the importance of a results-based, performance-based culture as well, because as we've said right at the front end of all of this, a sort of common philosophy is pretty important to be able to lead people. So understanding what it is that ensures success, creates success, is something which needs to be embedded within each and every one of staff members within the organisation. So, that in itself requires leadership, strong leadership from the top. But it needs to be, again, embedded within our systems to ensure that people understand the importance of good and strong performance, and whatever area of work that they happen to be involved in. Looking at core competences beyond just the performance of your job, whether, again, it's in a functional area of logistics or in assessment and the like. And those core competences, which are fundamental to breeding, developing good leaders, is something else which we're paying much greater attention to. So there's a variety of different things that one can do in an organisation to identify those people with core leadership skills, but that you need to be quite proactive in putting in place the mechanisms, the systems, the processes to make it happen.
Thank you.
I'm really sounding like a bureaucrat.
No. Your message is clear, Chris.
Can I just say something about sounding like a bureaucrat?
Go on, yeah.
Because I think the really difficult. I think the really difficult thing about this, the message that came out of the report, and I think we need to think about this. All of us, if we actually if we want leadership to be better, as it's been defined here, then hopefully some of the recommendations here will help to make that happen. These are difficult recommendations to get traction for, and I think, and I've been sort of thinking about why is this, and actually conversation that we were having earlier before was, made me think about it, that the narrative is not very good. The narrative of this report, you don't get, sort of sorting out organograms at the OK Corral, The heroic narrative of the individual. John Wayne doesn't spend a lot of time, sort of working on standard operating procedures, and so there is a problem here in terms of they don't make a good story. They might be really important. They might actually contribute to saving many people's lives, but the story is a difficult story to tell because we are used to a certain sort of heroic narrative. And I think that's something that is probably useful for us all to consider. And the other thing I'd just like to say about that is I think the story is also difficult to tell, and it's why I would really commend all of us to look at the work that these three agencies have done, because it, in different ways, I think all, World Vision and Oxfam and WFP have all looked at ways of getting around this, because it's very easy to send people on a training course. It's very easy to design a training course and send people on it. The job has been done, the product has been created. The actual sort of going back and working through the organisational systems and the organisation taking responsibility is much, much harder. So anyhow, just if you could, sorry for that, but a couple of reflections on where do we go from here and how difficult it might be. And I think we have a lot to learn.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. I know there are lots more questions in the room, but we have now reached 4 o'clock. And so I suggest that if people are absolutely burning to ask their question, then make sure you catch a panelist before they disappear. But I think where Paul has left it is a very good challenge indeed, because this is an excellent report. This has been a very vibrant discussion, but it's only part of the discussion. And I know for ALNAP, I mean, this is one piece of research and one debate as part of a stream which you're going to be taking forward. And I think as members of the humanitarian sector, that's an incredibly valuable and helpful thing. So I know we will be continuing to be part of that conversation in future. So thank you very much indeed, Paul and ALNAP, for such a fascinating and timely challenge and update. And while we're thanking people, on behalf of ALNAP, we'd just like to thank ODI for hosting the event, which has been excellent, and also a few individuals. Maria Gilly, who is the event organiser for ALNAP, who I don't think is here today, but who has done an enormous amount in getting things together and making this happen. And then Leah Campbell and Eleanor Mayer-Jones, who have not only been part of preparing the event, but also the research itself. So without whom this sort of thing just does not happen. So humanitarian response doesn't happen without leadership, but there are lots of other things involved as well. So most of all, though, thank you very much indeed for those of you in the room and for all those of you online. I hope you found this as fascinating, challenging and thought-provoking as I have. And thank you very much indeed for being part of it. And especially thank you to Chris Kay and Steve Goodsword for being such fantastic panellists, and Paul for prompting this and getting this together. So thank you very much indeed, and we look forward to continuing the conversation in future. Thank you.